Angela Marshall sat behind the wheel of her car, her eyes fixed on the fading light of dusk as it stretched across the skyline. She loved this time of day, the quiet moments just before the world shifted into the rush of evening. But tonight, as the sun dipped behind the city's towering buildings, her mind wasn't on the beauty of the scene. Instead, it lingered on the weight of her new position. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you like this story, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is going to be just as special. A black woman in charge of one of the city's most controversial precincts, an appointment many had seen as a bold move, but one that others, like Sergeant Jeff, saw as an affront to everything they believed in. Angela had faced adversity before, plenty of it, but this was different. This was a battlefield where the enemy wasn't always visible, and trust had to be earned every single day. As she drove, Angela's thoughts drifted back to her roots, to her father's words of wisdom. Leonard Marshall had been a beacon of hope in the community, a man who fought for civil rights in a time when speaking out could mean risking everything. Angela admired his strength, his courage, and his unwavering belief that justice would always prevail if good people stood up for what was right. But her father had also been a realist. He knew the fight wasn't easy, especially for someone like Angela, a black woman navigating a world dominated by men, most of them white, who saw her as an outsider. She had faced countless obstacles throughout her career, from subtle slights to outright hostility, yet each challenge had only steeled her resolve. The hum of her engine was the only sound as Angela turned onto a familiar street, her mind already shifting to the next day's challenges. She had inherited a department in turmoil, with officers divided over her leadership and a community that had long lost faith in the police. Reforming the precinct wouldn't just be about policy changes. It would require shifting deeply ingrained attitudes, confronting prejudices, and holding officers accountable in ways they'd never been before. Just as she was lost in thought, the flash of red and blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror, jolting her from her reverie. Angela's pulse quickened, a flicker of disbelief passing through her. It couldn't be. Not her. Slowing her car, she pulled over to the side of the road, her mind racing as the police cruiser pulled up behind her. The irony of the situation hit her with full force. Two officers, undoubtedly unaware of who she was, had decided to pull her over on a quiet street in the very city she was supposed to protect. Taking a deep breath, Angela kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her training kicking in. Years of experience in law enforcement had taught her how to handle tense situations, and this, no doubt, was about to become one. She had no idea what had prompted the stop, but she could guess. It was a scenario she'd seen play out before, countless times. A black woman driving alone in a nice neighborhood. Suspicion followed as if it were her shadow. The officers approached her vehicle, their steps slow, deliberate. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, knocked on her window with an air of authority, his eyes narrowing as he peered inside. His partner hung back, arms crossed over his chest, surveying the street as if ready for something more than a routine stop. Angela rolled down her window, her face expressionless, but her mind working furiously. She had a choice to make. She could reveal her identity right away, ending this interaction before it even began. Or she could wait, see how far they were willing to go, and let the situation play out. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the best way to expose the truth is to let people show you who they really are. "License and registration, ma'am," the officer demanded, his voice gruff but clipped. Angela handed over her documents without a word. She had nothing to hide, but she knew that wasn't the point. This wasn't about her speeding or violating any traffic law. This was about the assumptions they had made before they even saw her face. The officer glanced at her license briefly, his brow furrowing. "What are you doing in this part of town?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. It wasn't a question about her actual business. It was a challenge, a probe into her right to exist in a space that, in his mind, she didn't belong. Angela met his gaze calmly, her voice steady, as she replied, "I live around here." Her response seemed to agitate him, though she couldn't see why. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of him with the assumptions he had already formed. His partner, the quieter one, finally spoke up, his eyes scanning the area. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, his voice lacking the same bite as his partner's. "We need to know what you're doing here at this time." Angela sighed inwardly. She had heard this line before, too many times to count. It was the standard tactic, an excuse to assert control, to make her feel small. But she wasn't just another woman pulled over for a routine traffic stop. She was the one in charge now, And yet these officers didn't know that. They had no idea they had stopped the woman who held more authority than they could imagine. "I was on my way home," she replied evenly, offering no more than that. She could sense their frustration building, her calm demeanor unsettling them. The taller officer, who had introduced himself as Stevens, leaned in closer, his face now inches from hers. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." For a moment, Angela considered her options. She could play along, step out of the car, and let this charade continue, or she could assert her authority and shut it down right now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Two officers, drunk on their own power, had no idea that they were trying to intimidate their own boss. Angela smiled inwardly, but kept her expression neutral. This was going to be interesting. Angela glanced up at Officer Stevens, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills. She could feel his confidence, his sense of authority, and she knew what was coming next. He didn't expect her to resist. He expected her to comply, to submit to his demands without question. But Angela had spent her entire career fighting that very assumption. Instead of stepping out, she locked eyes with Stevens and spoke quietly, but firmly. "Do you know who I am, officer?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, glancing at his partner, Officer Daniels, for a moment before returning his gaze to her. "Ma'am, I asked you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice a little less sure than before. But Angela didn't budge. "I'll ask you again," she said, her tone still calm but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Do you know who I am?" Stevens blinked, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. He straightened up slightly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "No, ma'am, I don't. But that doesn't change the fact that you need to—" "I'm your new commander," Angela cut in, her voice low but powerful. "Chief Angela Marshall." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, everything was still. Stevens's eyes widened in shock, and Daniels shifted uncomfortably behind him. The realization hit them both at once. This wasn't just another routine stop. They had pulled over the very woman who now had the power to decide their careers, their futures. Stevens stepped back, his face a mask of disbelief. "Chief Marshall?" he stammered, glancing down at the license in his hand as if expecting it to tell him something different. I didn't know," Angela raised an eyebrow, watching as the color drained from his face. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check," she said calmly. "Instead, you assumed based on what you saw, not on what you knew." The silence that followed was deafening. Stevens stood frozen, his hands still gripping her license and registration, while Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his partner and Angela. She could see the gears turning in their minds, the dawning realization that their authority had just crumbled beneath them. Angela took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the moment. "Now, Officer Stevens," she said, her voice measured, "do you want to explain to me why you decided to pull me over?" Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence, his sense of control had been stripped away in an instant, leaving him grasping for something, anything, that would give him an out. But there wasn't one. Angela could see the struggle in his eyes, the panic of someone who had just realized they were in way over their head. He was trying to find a way to salvage the situation, to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. I didn't mean," Stevens began, his voice faltering. "You didn't mean to pull over your commanding officer," Angela finished for him, her tone sharp. "Or you didn't mean to make assumptions about me because of the color of my skin." The question cut through the air like a knife, leaving Stevens speechless. Daniels, who had been silent this whole time, finally stepped forward, his face pale. "Chief Marshall, we didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We had no idea it was you." Angela turned her gaze to Daniels, her eyes narrowing. "That's exactly the problem, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice cold. "You didn't know it was me, so you thought it was okay to treat me like this. If I wasn't the chief, how far would this have gone? What would you have done?" Daniels swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "We were just following procedure," he mumbled, but even he didn't sound convinced. Angela shook her head slowly. "This isn't procedure," she said, her voice laced with anger. "This is profiling, this is harassment, and it's exactly the kind of behavior I'm here to put an end to." Stevens shifted uncomfortably, still clutching her documents as if they were some kind of lifeline. "Chief, we're sorry. We didn't mean—" "Sorry doesn't cut it," Angela interrupted, her tone sharp. What I need from you is better judgment, better behavior. I need you to start treating every person you encounter with the same respect and professionalism you would give me if you had known who I was." The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension. Angela could see the shame in their faces, the realization that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. But shame wasn't enough. She needed accountability. She needed to make sure this didn't happen again. Not to her, and not to anyone else. "Here's what's going to happen," Angela said, her voice firm. "You're going to hand me back my license and registration. And then you're going to report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. We're going to have a very serious discussion about what happened here tonight. And we're going to make sure this kind of behavior doesn't continue in this department." Stevens' hands shook slightly as he handed her the documents. "Yes, Chief," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Angela took the papers from him, her eyes never leaving his. "I expect you to reflect on what happened here tonight," she said, her tone steely. "And I expect you to come to my office, ready to take responsibility for your actions. Do I make myself clear?" Both officers nodded, their heads bowed slightly in defeat. "Yes, Chief," they murmured in unison. Without another word, Angela rolled up her window and started her car. As she pulled away from the curb, leaving the two officers standing in the fading light, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was just the beginning. Angela drove through the city streets, her thoughts still lingering on the encounter with Stevens and Daniels. The shock on their faces, the weight of their embarrassment. It had been a powerful moment, one she knew they wouldn't soon forget, but there was no time to dwell on the past. The next morning's meeting was going to be the real test, not just for the two officers, but for the entire department. As she pulled into the driveway of her home, the reality of the situation began to settle in. It wasn't just about teaching Stevens and Daniels a lesson. It was about reshaping the entire culture of the precinct. Angela knew that the behavior she had witnessed wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger problem, one that had been festering for years. And now, it was her job to root it out. The next morning, Angela arrived at the precinct early, her mind already focused on the difficult conversations ahead. She entered her office, greeted by the familiar hum of activity outside her door. But there was a tension in the air, a sense that everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. At precisely 8 a.m., there was a knock on her door. "Come in," Angela called, her voice steady. Stevens and Daniels entered, their expressions a mix of nervousness and regret. They stood at attention, waiting for her to speak. Angela remained seated behind her desk, her eyes fixed on them for a long moment before she finally broke the silence. "Take a seat," she said, her voice calm but firm. The two officers sat down, their posture rigid, their eyes cast downward. "I don't need to remind you why you're here," Angela began, her tone measured. "But I do want to make one thing clear. What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem, one that's been allowed to fester in this department for far too long. And I'm here to put an end to it." Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Daniels remained silent, his eyes focused on the floor. "I've spent my entire career working to change the way law enforcement interacts with the communities we serve," Angela continued. "But change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without accountability. That's why we're having this conversation today. Because if we're going to move forward as a department, we need to start by addressing the issues right here, within these walls." Stevens finally spoke, his voice shaky. "Chief, we didn't mean to." Angela held up a hand, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said, her tone sharp. "What matters is what you did. You made assumptions based on my appearance. You treated me as less than, not because of anything I did, but because of what you thought I was. And that is unacceptable." Daniel shifted in his seat, his face pale. "We didn't know, Chief. If we had known—" "And that's exactly the problem," Angela said, her voice hard. "You didn't know it was me, so you felt justified in treating me the way you did. But it shouldn't matter who I am. You should be treating every person you encounter with the same level of respect, whether they're the chief of police or a citizen driving through the neighborhood." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick with tension. Angela could see the guilt in their faces, the realization that they had made a serious mistake. But guilt wasn't enough. She needed them to understand the deeper issue at play. "This department has a history," Angela said, her voice softening just slightly. "A history of profiling, of making assumptions about people based on the color of their skin or the way they look. And that has to stop. We can't expect the community to trust us if we're not willing to hold ourselves to the highest standards." Stevens nodded slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment. You're right, Chief, he said quietly. We messed up, and we'll do better. I'll do better. Angela watched him closely, searching his face for sincerity. She could see that he was genuinely shaken, but she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. You will do better, she said, her voice firm. Because I'm going to make sure of it. Starting today, you're both enrolled in mandatory bias training. You're going to learn how to interact with people in a way that reflects the values of this department, the values we should have had all along. Daniels finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We're sorry, Chief. We won't let it happen again. Angela nodded, her expression softening slightly. I believe you, Officer Daniels, but I also want you to understand that this isn't just about you. It's about the entire department. And if we're going to make real change, it has to start with each and every one of us. The two officers sat in silence, their faces etched with remorse. Angela could see that they were beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation, but she also knew that this was just the first step in a long process. Now, I'm going to give you both a chance, Angela said, her voice steady. A chance to prove that you can be part of the solution. But make no mistake, there will be no second chances. If I see any behavior like this again, you'll be out of this department faster than you can blink. Do I make myself clear? Both officers nodded, their heads bowed in shame. Yes, Chief, they murmured. Angela leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. Good. Now get out there and start doing your jobs the right way. The two officers stood and left the room, their steps heavy with the weight of the conversation. As the door closed behind them, Angela allowed herself a moment to breathe. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of real progress. She had taken the first step in holding her officers accountable. Now it was time to start transforming the entire department, one officer at a time. Angela watched as the door closed behind Stevens and Daniels. The conversation had been tough, but necessary. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep sigh. There was still so much to do, so much change to bring to the department. And this wasn't just about those two officers. It was about the entire precinct, and by extension, the entire city. The day was just beginning, but Angela's mind was already racing with thoughts about how to continue the reform she had started. She knew that the resistance she had faced so far was only the tip of the iceberg. There would be more officers, more systemic issues, and more pushback from those who were deeply invested in the status quo. She looked out of her office window, watching the morning light filter through the trees outside the station. The city was waking up, but Angela knew that for many, the issues of injustice and discrimination were a constant reality. It was her responsibility now to make sure that the department didn't contribute to that reality anymore. A knock on the door brought her back to the present. It was Lieutenant Harrison, one of the few people in the department Angela felt she could trust completely. A seasoned officer with a reputation for fairness, Harrison had been supportive of Angela since her appointment as chief. Chief, you got a minute? Harrison asked, stepping into the office. Angela nodded. Of course. Come in, Lieutenant. Harrison took a seat across from her, his face serious. I heard about what happened with Stevens and Daniels, he said. Word's been going around the station. Angela wasn't surprised. I figured it would. People need to know that behavior like that won't be tolerated. They do, Harrison agreed, his expression thoughtful. But I think you need to be prepared for more of it. There's a lot of resentment in the ranks right now. Some of the old guard, they're not happy with the changes you're trying to make. Angela leaned forward, her elbows resting on her desk. I know, but that doesn't mean I'm going to back down. If anything, it means I need to push harder. Harrison nodded, but there was concern in his eyes. I get that, Chief, and I'm with you. But you've got to be smart about this. Some of these guys, they've been in the department for decades. They know how to work the system. They're not going to come at you head on. They'll find ways to undermine you from the shadows. Angela sat back, considering his words. She knew he was right. The resistance she faced wouldn't always be obvious. It would be subtle. Small acts of defiance, whispers in the locker room, procedures intentionally slowed down. It would be a war fought on multiple fronts, and Angela had to be ready for that. I appreciate the warning, Harrison, she said, her voice firm, but I didn't take this job to play it safe. If they want to push back, let them. I'm ready. Harrison smiled slightly. I figured you'd say that. Just know that I've got your back. And there are others, too. Not everyone in the department is stuck in the old ways. Some of us want to see things change for the better. Angela felt a small sense of relief at his words. Having allies within the department was crucial, especially now. Thanks, Harrison. That means a lot. We're going to need all the help we can get. Harrison stood up, nodding. I'll keep my ear to the ground, let you know if I hear anything that you should be aware of. As he left the office, Angela felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who believed in the changes she was trying to make, people who wanted to see the department transformed. But the real question was, how many? And would it be enough? Later that afternoon, Angela had another meeting scheduled, this time with the mayor's office. The mayor had publicly supported her appointment as chief, but Angela knew that his support could be fragile if the political wind shifted. The public image of the department was still a major concern, and any scandal or misstep could bring unwanted attention to City Hall. The meeting was to discuss her progress in implementing reforms, and Angela had prepared a detailed report. She knew she had to be transparent about the challenges she was facing, but also show that progress was being made. As she arrived at the mayor's office, Angela was greeted by the mayor's chief of staff, a sharp woman named Denise Patterson. Denise had been the mayor's right hand for years, and Angela respected her no-nonsense approach. "Chief Wilson, good to see you," Denise said, shaking her hand. "The mayor's ready for you." Angela followed Denise into the mayor's office, where Mayor Thompson was waiting. A middle-aged man with a politician's easy smile, he rose from behind his desk and extended his hand to Angela. "Chief Wilson, always a pleasure," the mayor said, his voice warm. "I've been hearing good things about the work you're doing at the precinct." Angela shook his hand, returning the smile. "Thank you, Mayor. We've made some progress, but there's still a long way to go." The mayor motioned for her to sit, and Angela took a seat across from him. Denise stood to the side, her arms crossed, watching the conversation intently. "I wanted to touch base with you," the mayor began. "Get a sense of how the reforms are going. I know this is a tough job, but the community is watching, and we need to show them that we're serious about change." Angela nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, and I agree. The community has every right to hold us accountable. That's why I've been focusing on internal reforms, bias training, new oversight measures, and addressing some of the more deeply rooted issues within the department." The mayor leaned back in his chair, listening carefully. "And how's that going?" Any pushback?" Angela hesitated for a moment. She knew she had to be honest, but she also didn't want it to give the impression that things were spiraling out of control. "There's been some resistance," she admitted, "especially from the more senior officers who are used to the old way of doing things. But we're addressing it. Slowly but surely, we're making progress." The mayor glanced at Denise, who gave a small nod. "I appreciate your candor, Chief," he said. Turning back to Angela, "I know it's not easy, but you have our support, as long as the community feels like they're seeing real change." Angela appreciated the reassurance, but she knew it came with a caveat. The mayor's support was conditional, based on public perception. If the community turned against her, so would the mayor's office. "I'm committed to making this work," Angela said firmly. "But we need time. The issues we're dealing with are systemic. They've been part of the department for decades. We can't fix them overnight." The mayor nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Just keep me in the loop. We need to show the public that we're making progress, even if it's gradual." Angela left the meeting feeling a mix of determination and pressure. The mayor's support was crucial, but it was clear that she was walking a fine line. One misstep in the political fallout could be disastrous, but Angela had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She was here to do a job, and no matter how difficult it got, she wasn't going to back down. The department needed to change, and she was the one who would make sure it happened, no matter what the cost. As Angela left City Hall and headed back to the precinct, she couldn't help but replay the meeting with the mayor in her mind. The pressure was palpable. Public perception mattered, and it was clear the mayor's support was tied to how well the community felt the department was addressing their concerns. But there was more at stake than just politics. This was about real change, about breaking down barriers that had been in place for too long. Back at the precinct, Angela knew she had to address another issue immediately. Her meeting with Harrison had reminded her that she couldn't just focus on external relationships with the community. She needed to make sure her team, especially the officers who were loyal to the old ways, didn't undermine her from within. If her own officers weren't on board with the changes, it would be impossible to rebuild trust with the public. The moment she walked into the station, she could feel the tension in the air. Officers glanced at her as she passed, some with respect, others with skepticism. Angela could almost hear the murmurs behind her back, the doubt, the whispers that she was pushing too hard, trying to change too much too fast. But that didn't matter. Angela had been underestimated before, and she had come out on top every time. This was no different. She stopped by her office briefly, gathering her thoughts before heading down to the squad room, where she knew a few key officers would be meeting soon. It was time to have a more direct conversation. When she arrived, several officers were already seated, drinking coffee and chatting. Sergeant Jeffrey was among them, the man who had been most vocal about his displeasure with her leadership. Angela watched him for a moment before stepping inside. "Morning, everyone," she said, her voice clear and strong. The conversation died down immediately, and all eyes turned to her. Jeffrey leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, a hint of defiance in his posture. "Chief," he greeted her coolly. Angela didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I know some of you have concerns about the direction we're taking with the department," she began, her tone steady. "I've heard the whispers, and I'm aware that not everyone is on board with the changes we're implementing." She could see a few of the officers exchange glances, and Jeffrey's expression tightened. "But let me be clear," Angela continued, her voice firm. "The days of operating like we always have are over. We are here to serve this community. We are here to build trust, not tear it down. And if you're not willing to be part of that, then maybe you need to think about whether this department is still the right place for you." Jeffrey straightened in his seat, his expression hardening. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "some of us have been doing this job for a long time. We know how things work. We're not the problem here." Angela held his gaze, unflinching. "And that's exactly the attitude that needs to change. The way things have been done for a long time hasn't worked. It's alienated the very people we're supposed to protect. If you think we're going to keep doing things the old way, you're mistaken." Jeffrey's jaw clenched, and for a moment Angela wondered if he was going to push back harder. But instead he leaned back again, crossing his arms. "We'll see how long this new way lasts," he muttered. Angela wasn't about to let that slide. "It will last as long as I'm here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And if you think you can undermine me, you're in for a rude awakening." The room was silent. Angela knew she had made her point. Some of the officers still looked uncomfortable, but others, Harrison among them, nodded in sullen agreement. "Now, I'm not asking for anyone to be perfect," Angela continued, softening her tone slightly. "I know change is hard, but what I am asking for is that each and every one of you takes a long look in the mirror and asks yourself whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution. Because if you're part of the problem, there's no place for you in this department." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before turning to leave. As she walked out, she heard murmurs behind her again, but this time they were quieter. The defiance wasn't as strong, and Angela knew she had made an impact. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The resistance from officers like Jeffrey wasn't going to disappear overnight, and there were likely others who would follow his lead. But Angela was ready. She had come too far to back down now. Later that evening, as Angela sat in her office reviewing reports, she got a call from Harrison. His voice was urgent, and Angela could hear the tension in his words. "Chief, we've got a situation," Harrison said. "There's a protest forming outside the station." Angela's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let the surprise show in her voice. "A protest? What's it about?" "Word got out about Stevens and Daniels," Harrison explained. "Apparently, some community members are demanding accountability for what happened. They want to make sure there are consequences." Angela stood up from her desk, already moving toward the door. "I'll be right there." As she made her way outside, Angela could hear the faint sounds of chanting. The protest wasn't large yet, but it was growing, and the anger was palpable. A group of community leaders stood at the front, holding signs that demanded justice and transparency. Angela took a deep breath as she approached. She recognized some of the faces in the crowd, people she had met with before during her early outreach efforts. They had been hopeful about her leadership, but now they wanted action. She stepped forward, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Let's talk," she said, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. The chanting quieted, and one of the leaders, a woman named Alicia, stepped forward. She had been one of Angela's strongest allies in the community, but now her face was set in a determined expression. "Chief Wilson," Alicia said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "we're here because we need to see real change. Your officers can't keep treating people like this without consequences." Angela nodded, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I hear you, and I agree. Stevens and Daniels are being held accountable. There's an internal investigation underway, and I promise you there will be consequences." Alicia crossed her arms, clearly not satisfied. "We've heard promises before, Chief. What we need is action." Angela met her gaze, knowing this was a pivotal moment. You have my word, Alicia. This department is going to change, and I need your help to make sure it happens. But you have to give us time to do it right. The crowd was quiet, waiting for Alicia's response. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. We'll be watching, Chief. Don't let us down. Angela felt a wave of relief, but she knew this was only the beginning. The community was watching, and now more than ever, she had to prove that her promises weren't empty. Marcia took a moment to compose herself as she got back into her car, the weight of her role pressing down on her. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, but her mind was far from calm. The confrontation with the officers had left a mark on her. They tried to exert their authority over her, tried to make her feel small, but she had turned the tables. Now, she had to do something far more challenging than putting two misguided officers in their place. She had to reform an entire precinct and change the culture from within. Back at the precinct, the buzz of activity was just as she left it. Officers moved about their duties, some barely acknowledging her presence. She knew that in their eyes, she was still an anomaly. A black woman at the top of the chain of command in a place that had long resisted change. Lieutenant Casey, her second in command, met her in the hallway. Casey had been supportive of Marcia's appointment, but had seen his fair share of skepticism from the other officers. As she approached, his expression was one of concern. "Chief, I heard about the stop," Casey said, his voice low enough so only Marcia could hear. Words already spread through the precinct. "I figured as much," Marcia replied, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the encounter. "They didn't know who you were, did they?" Marcia shook her head. "No, but that's not the point. The problem is, it could have been anyone in that car, and the outcome would have been the same. The way they handled it, the assumptions, the disrespect, it's part of a much bigger issue." Casey nodded, understanding where she was coming from. "You're right, but you by no changing that culture. It's going to take time. Some of these guys have been working under the same system for decades. Time is a luxury we don't have, Casey. I'm not here to make minor adjustments. This department needs a transformation. And that starts with accountability." They walked together down the hallway, and Marcia could feel the eyes of the officers following them. The tension was palpable. They knew she wasn't just another chief who would maintain the status quo. Inside her office, Marcia sat down at her desk, staring at the mountain of paperwork that had piled up. Reports of misconduct, complaints from the community, internal memos, all evidence of a system in need of reform. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was from Teresa, one of the officers who had shown early support for Marcia's leadership. The message was brief but direct. "We need to talk. It's urgent." Marcia quickly texted back and set up a time to meet later that day. She could already sense that whatever it wasn't going to be good news. As she sat back in her chair, her thoughts drifted to the community she had promised to protect and serve. Trust between the department and the people had been eroded long before she took the job, and rebuilding that trust was one of her top priorities. But how could she expect the community to believe in change when the officers themselves were resistant to it? Later that day, Marcia met Teresa in a quiet corner of the precinct. Teresa's face was tight with concern, her usually confident demeanor replaced by a hint of nervousness. "Chief, there's been talk, serious talk, among some of the senior officers. They're not happy with the direction you're taking the department." Marcia's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not here to make friends, Teresa. I'm here to do what's right." "I know that, but this goes beyond grumbling. They're organizing, trying to push back against the reforms you're implementing. And from what I've heard, it's not just talk anymore." Marcia's jaw clenched slightly. "What exactly are they planning?" Teresa glanced around, lowering her voice even further. "There's a group of them, mostly older guys who've been here for years. They've been meeting after hours, talking about ways to make your life difficult. They want to undermine your leadership, make it seem like the changes you're pushing are making things worse, not better." Marcia took a deep breath, her mind working quickly to process this new information. She had anticipated resistance, but hearing that it was more organized than she expected lit a fire in her. This was no longer just about changing procedures. It was about taking on a deeply ingrained system that didn't want her there. "Who's leading it?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Teresa hesitated for a moment before responding. "Sergeant Daniels." Marcia's eyes narrowed. Sergeant Daniels had been a thorn in her side since the day she took over. He was a respected veteran of the department, but his loyalty was to the old ways, the ways that had kept people like him in power and people like her out. "I should have seen this coming," Marcia said, her tone sharp. "He's been undermining me from the start." Teresa nodded. "It's not just him, though. There are others, enough to cause real problems if they're not stopped." Marcia leaned back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was bigger than just one officer. It was a fight for the future of the precinct. If Daniels and his group succeeded, it would be a signal to everyone that the old ways still held power, and Marcia's efforts would be crushed before they could truly take root. "I'm not backing down," Marcia said, her voice full of conviction. "Daniels and his group can try all they want, but they're not going to stop me. This department will change, whether they like it or not." Teresa nodded, her respect for Marcia growing even more. "I've got your back, Chief, but be careful. They're playing dirty." Marcia stood up, her mind made up. Let them. I've dealt with worse. The road ahead was going to be rough, but Marcia wasn't one to back down from a fight. This was about more than just her position. It was about justice, fairness, and making sure that the community she served could finally trust the people meant to protect them. As she stared out the window, watching the city she had grown up in, she knew that the battle was only just beginning. Marcia knew the fight was just beginning. As she stood in front of the precinct window, watching the city she was sworn to protect, she couldn't help but feel a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about changing policies or procedures. It was about transforming an entire culture of injustice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. But she couldn't do it alone, and more importantly, she couldn't let the resistance within her department gain any more ground. The next morning, Marcia called an emergency meeting with her trusted officers, including Teresa and Lieutenant Casey. As they gathered in the conference room, the tension was palpable. The stakes were high, and everyone in that room knew it. "Thank you all for coming," Marcia began, her voice firm and unwavering. "We've got a serious problem on our hands, and it's time we confront it head on." She paused, looking around the room. She could see the concern etched on the faces of her officers, but also a quiet determination. They believed in her, and they believed in the change she was fighting for. "We all know there's been resistance to the reforms I've been trying to implement. Some officers don't want things to change. They're clinging to the old ways, and they're organizing against me, and against all of us who are trying to do the right thing." Casey nodded, his arms crossed as he listened intently. Teresa remained quiet but alert, ready to act at a moment's notice. "We can't afford to let this grow any further," Marcia continued. "If Daniels and his group succeed in undermining me, everything we've worked for will be destroyed. The community's trust will be shattered, and this department will fall right back into the old patterns of abuse and discrimination." Casey finally spoke up. "What's the plan, Chief? How do we stop them?" Marcia leaned forward, her eyes sharp with focus. "We start by identifying who's with us and who's against us. I'm not asking for a witch hunt, but we need to know who we can trust. There are officers on the fence, officers who are afraid to speak up because they don't know where they stand. We need to bring them over to our side. And we need to do it fast." Teresa glanced at Marcia. "I've already started talking to some of the officers. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there are also those who want to see change. We can rally them, but we need to show that we're serious about making this department better." Marcia nodded. "Exactly. The only way to win this fight is to lead by example. We need to make it clear that the old ways of doing things are over, but we also need to give people a reason to believe that the new way is better." Casey looked thoughtful for a moment. "And what about Daniels? He's not just going to sit back and let this happen. He's got a lot of influence with the older officers, and he's been here long enough to know how to manipulate things behind the scenes." Marcia's expression hardened. "Daniels is a problem, but we'll deal with him when the time comes. Right now, we need to focus on solidifying our position. If we can build enough momentum, Daniels won't have a choice but to back down or leave." The room fell silent for a moment as Marcia's words sank in. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one officer or one precinct. It was about the future of the entire department and possibly the entire city. "We'll start by reaching out to the officers we know we can trust," Marcia said, breaking the silence. "Teresa, I need you to keep gathering information on Daniels and his group. Find out who's meeting with him and what their plans are. Casey, you'll be working with me on a community outreach initiative. We need to show the public that we're serious about reform, and we need to do it now." Both officers nodded, their commitment clear. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Marcia met with officers, reviewed case files, and started laying the groundwork for her next big move, an initiative that would bring the community and the police closer together. She knew that if she could win over the community, it would be a powerful tool in her fight against the resistance inside the department. Later that evening, Marcia received a call from one of the community leaders she had been working with, an activist named Malcolm. He had been vocal about police reform for years and had gained a lot of respect in the city for his tireless efforts to hold law enforcement accountable. "Chief Wilson, we need to talk," Malcolm said, his tone serious but respectful. "I've been hearing things. People are starting to wonder if you're really going to follow through on your promises. They want to know if you're just another face in a long line of police chiefs who talk about change, but never actually make it happen. Marcia took a deep breath. She had been expecting this. Malcolm, I get it. I know people are frustrated, and I know they're skeptical, but I'm not like the others. I'm not here to maintain the status quo. I'm here to tear it down and build something better. I believe you, Chief, but you need to understand something. The people out here, they don't just need words, they need action. They need to see that you're really committed to changing things, and they need to see it now. Right. So Marcia nodded, even though Malcolm couldn't see her. I hear you. That's why I'm launching a new initiative. We're going to bring the community into the precinct and give them a real voice in how we operate. I'm forming a community oversight board, and I want you to be a part of it. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Malcolm responded. A community oversight board? That's a start, Chief, but it's got to have real power. It can't just be for show. It won't be for show, Marcia replied, her voice firm. The board will have the authority to review complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and work directly with me to ensure that we're making real progress. And I'm going to make sure the board is made up of people who understand the community and the struggles they have been through. Malcolm was quiet for a moment, considering her words. If you're serious about this, Chief, then you've got my support. But understand this, you only get one shot at this. If the community feels like you've let them down, there's no coming back from that. Marcia understood the weight of what Malcolm was saying. The pressure was immense, but she had no intention of backing down. I won't let them down, Malcolm. I promise you that. They ended the call, and Marcia sat back in her chair, the weight of her responsibility settling over her once again. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the obstacles were many. But she knew one thing for sure. Change was coming, and no matter how hard the resistance fought against her, she was determined to see it through. The next few days were crucial. Marcia knew that every move she made from here on out had to be calculated and strategic. The community was watching closely, and Daniels and his group were likely waiting for any misstep they could exploit. But she didn't have time to hesitate. Her focus now was on putting her plans into action. The first step was the formation of the Community Oversight Board. Marcia worked tirelessly with Teresa and Casey to finalize the details. They carefully selected community leaders who had been vocal about the need for police reform, people who were respected by their neighbors and who would bring an honest, unflinching perspective to the table. Among those invited were Malcolm and Alicia, both of whom had been skeptical of the department in the past, but were now cautiously optimistic about the changes Marcia was proposing. By the end of the week, the board was ready. Marcia stood in the precinct's largest conference room, waiting as the members of the oversight board began to file in. She had met most of them before, either at protests or during community meetings. Each of them carried with them the weight of their community's trust, and Marcia understood the responsibility she now bore to deliver on her promises. Alicia was one of the first to arrive, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she took her seat. Malcolm followed closely behind her, nodding in Marcia's direction as he sat down. There were a few others, a pastor, a local business owner, a retired school teacher, and a young activist who had recently gained prominence for his outspoken criticism of police practices in the city. Once everyone was seated, Marcia stood at the front of the room, her hands resting on the edge of the conference table. She could feel the weight of their expectations, and she knew she couldn't afford to let them down. Thank you all for being here, Marcia began, her voice calm but authoritative. I know many of you have been skeptical about the changes we've been discussing, and I understand why. This department has a long history of failing the very people it's supposed to serve. But that ends now. She paused, looking around the room, meeting each person's gaze in turn. I didn't take this job to maintain the status quo. I took this job to change it, and I need your help to do that. This board isn't just for show. You will have real power. Power to review complaints, power to hold officers accountable, and power to help us rebuild trust with the community. Malcolm leaned forward, his arms resting on the table. That all sounds good, Chief, but we've heard promises like this before. What makes this different? Marcia nodded, expecting the question. What makes this different is that I'm giving you access to everything. Every report, every complaint, every disciplinary action. We're not hiding anything. This board will have full transparency, and I will personally work with you to ensure that we're making real progress. Alicia crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. And what happens when officers push back? Because they will. You've already got resistance in your ranks, Chief. How do we know this board won't just be another layer of bureaucracy that gets ignored when things get tough? Marcia took a deep breath, knowing this was a pivotal moment. I'm not naive. I know there's resistance, and I know it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I'm committed to this, and I'm not backing down. If officers can't adapt to the changes we're making, then they won't be part of this department anymore. I'm willing to make tough decisions to ensure that we're moving forward. There was a moment of silence as the members of the board absorbed her words. Marcia could see the doubt still lingering in some of their faces. But there was also a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Malcolm was the first to speak again. If you're serious about this, Chief, then you've got my support. But like I said before, you've got one shot. The community's trust is fragile, and if we feel like we've been let down again, there's no coming back from that. I understand, Marcia replied, and I'm not asking for blind faith. I'm asking for your partnership. Together, we can make this department something the community can trust again. Alicia leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed, but her posture less defensive. All right, Chief, I'm willing to see where this goes. But like Malcolm said, actions speak louder than words. We'll be watching closely. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing the logistics of how the Oversight Board would operate, reviewing case files, and outlining the board's role in the department's decision-making process. Marcia made sure to emphasize that the board's input would not only be heard but acted upon. It wasn't just about giving the community a seat at the table. It was about giving them real power to influence the way the department operated. After the meeting, as the board members filed out of the room, Marcia felt a mix of relief and determination. The board was in place, and the groundwork for change had been laid. But she knew this was only the beginning. Winning the trust of the community was one battle, but the war would be fought within the walls of the precinct, and the next step was dealing with Daniels and his group. Teresa met Marcia outside the conference room, her expression serious. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected," Marcia replied. "They're on board, but they're watching us closely. We've got to show them that we're serious about this." Teresa nodded. "And what about Daniels?" Marcia's jaw tightened. "He's not going to stop. We need to move forward with our plan. I want you to keep talking to the officers, find out who's on the fence, and bring them over to our side. The more support we have, the less power Daniels will have." Teresa glanced around to make sure no one was listening before speaking again. "There's something else you should know. I've been hearing rumors. Daniels and his group are planning something. I don't know what yet, but it's big." Marcia's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. "Keep digging. We need to know what we're up against." Teresa nodded, her face set with determination. "I'll find out, and when I do, we'll be ready." As Teresa walked away, Marcia took a deep breath. The pressure was mounting, and the stakes were higher than ever. But she couldn't afford to falter now. The future of the department and the community's trust depended on her ability to lead through the storm. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Marcia and Teresa worked around the clock, quietly reaching out to the officers who were still undecided about which side to take. They held private meetings, listened to concerns, and reassured them that the changes coming to the precinct would be for the better. Slowly but surely, the tide was beginning to turn. But despite the progress, the tension within the precinct was palpable. Everyone knew that something was brewing. Daniels and his group had become more vocal, spreading rumors about Marcia's leadership and trying to sow discord among the ranks. But Marcia remained focused. She knew that the real challenge was still ahead. One evening, as Marcia sat in her office reviewing reports, Teresa knocked on the door and stepped inside without waiting for a response. Her face was tense, and Marcia knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" Marcia asked, setting down the file she was reading. Teresa closed the door behind her and walked over to Marcia's desk. "I've got news. Daniels and his group are planning something big. They've been meeting in secret, and I've heard whispers that they're trying to organize a walkout." Marcia's heart sank. A walkout would be disastrous. If a large number of officers walked off the job, it would leave the precinct severely understaffed, putting both the department and the community at risk. It would also send a powerful message that the resistance to her leadership was stronger than she had anticipated. "How many officers are we talking about?" Marcia asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease she felt. Teresa sighed. "I don't know for sure, but it could be as many as a dozen. Maybe more." Marcia leaned back in her chair, processing the information. This was exactly the kind of power play she had been expecting from Daniels, but the scale of it was larger than she had anticipated. If this walkout happened, it could undermine everything she had been working toward, but she wasn't about to back down. "We can't let that happen," Marcia said after a long moment. "We need to get ahead of this." Teresa nodded. "Agreed, but how? Daniels is smart. He's been careful not to leave a trail. We can't prove anything without solid evidence, and if we confront him too early, it could backfire." Marcia tapped her fingers on the edge of her desk, thinking, "We don't need to prove anything. Not yet. What we need is to stop the walkout before it happens. We need to get more officers on our side. Officers who will stand with us when the time comes." Teresa raised an eyebrow. "You think we have enough time for that?" "We don't have a choice," Marcia replied. "We have to make sure that when Daniels makes his move, he doesn't have the numbers to succeed. Start reaching out to everyone we haven't talked to yet. I don't care if they're on the fence or if they've been resistant so far. We need to make it clear that there's no turning back. This department is changing, whether they like it or not." Teresa nodded, already pulling out her phone to start making calls. "I'll get on it right away." As Teresa left the office, Marcia sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. Daniels was making his move, and the battle for the precinct's future was about to reach its climax. But Marcia wasn't about to let him win. She had come too far, and she wasn't going to let a group of officers stuck in the past undo everything she had worked for. The next day, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Word had started to spread about Daniels' plan, and the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered in the hallways, and there was an unspoken sense of anticipation in the air, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Marcia moved through the precinct with a calm, steady demeanor, refusing to let the tension affect her. She knew that the officers were watching her closely, waiting to see how she would respond. But she wasn't about to give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. That afternoon, Marcia called a meeting with her most trusted officers, including Teresa and Casey. They gathered in her office, the door closed tightly behind them. "We've got a problem," Marcia began, looking around the room at the faces of the officers she trusted most. "Daniels is planning a walkout. He's trying to rally as many officers as he can to undermine my leadership and push back against the changes we're making." Casey frowned, his brow furrowed in concern. "How serious is this?" "Serious enough," Marcia replied. "If enough officers walk out, it could cripple the precinct. We need to stop it before it happens." Teresa leaned forward, her arms crossed over her chest. "I've been reaching out to the officers who are still on the fence, but it's not enough. Daniels has a lot of influence, especially with the older officers. They're loyal to him, and they don't want to see things change." Marcia nodded, knowing that Teresa was right. Daniels had spent years building his influence within the precinct, and there were plenty of officers who were comfortable with the old ways of doing things. But Marcia also knew that there were officers who wanted change, officers who believed in the vision she had for the future of the department. "We're going to need to be strategic about this," Marcia said, her mind working quickly. "We need to divide and conquer. Teresa, I want you to keep talking to the officers who are still undecided. Find out what their concerns are and address them. Casey, I need you to work on building support among the younger officers. They're the ones who are more open to change, and we need them on our side." Casey nodded. "I'm on it." Marcia crossed her arms, her tone unwavering. "I'm not asking anyone to follow me blindly. I'm asking them to do what's right. The way this department has been run, it's been broken for a long time. The community doesn't trust us, and for good reason. If you think that's acceptable, then you're part of the problem." Daniel smirked, shaking his head. "You sound just like one of those politicians. All talk, no action. You want to tear down everything we've built, just to score some points with the mayor or the press." Marcia felt her patience thinning, but she held her ground. "This isn't about politics, and it's not about the press. It's about serving the community the way we're supposed to. I didn't take this job to maintain the status quo, Daniels. I took it to fix the damage that's been done, and that means changing how we operate. Whether you like it or not, those changes are coming." Daniels let out a low, humorless laugh. "You really believe you're the one to do that, huh? You think you can take on all the history, all the resistance, and come out on top?" Marcia leaned in, her voice lowering to a dangerous edge. "Yes, I do. And if you're smart, you'll realize that fighting me isn't going to get you anywhere. The officers who want to see this department improve, they're already on board. You're running out of time to decide which side of history you want to be on." For the first time, Daniel's confidence seemed to falter. He glanced away as if considering her words, but Marcia wasn't about to give him an opening to maneuver. "Here's the deal," she continued. "You can either accept that things are changing and find a way to be part of the solution, or you can get out. But one thing is clear, you will not undermine me or this department any longer. The walkout you're planning, it's over. I'm not going to let you tear this place apart." Daniels remained silent, his face hard, but Marcia could see the gears turning in his mind. He was realizing that his power play wasn't going to work. She had confronted him head on, and now he had to decide if he was willing to go down with his rebellion. After a long pause, Daniels stood up from his desk, stepping around to face her directly. He crossed his arms, staring her down. I've been in this job a lot longer than you, he said slowly. I've seen Chief come and go. They all think they can change things, but it never lasts. This place, it's bigger than any one person. You might think you're in control, but there are forces at work here that you can't even begin to understand. Marcia didn't flinch. Maybe, but I'm not afraid of those forces. I've dealt with worse. And unlike the chiefs before me, I'm not going to back down when things get hard. Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. He stopped just before exiting and glanced back at her, his eyes sharp. We'll see, Chief. We'll see. With that, he walked out, leaving Marcia alone in the office. She exhaled slowly, her body still tense from the confrontation. She knew Daniels wasn't going to give up easily, but she had made it clear that she wasn't backing down. The fight for the precinct wasn't over, but she had just won an important battle. The next few days were tense. Word had spread quickly about Marcia's confrontation with Daniels, and the precinct was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Some officers admired her for standing up to him, while others were still on the fence, unsure of where they stood in the growing divide within the department. Teresa and Casey continued their work, talking to officers individually and trying to build support for Marcia's leadership. Slowly, they began to win more people over, but it was clear that the situation was still fragile. One evening, as Marcia was preparing to leave for the day, she received a call from Casey. "Chief, we've got a situation," he said, his voice tense. Marcia's heart sank. "What is it?" "It's Daniels. He's called a meeting with a bunch of the officers. Off the record, of course. It's happening tonight. I think he's making his move." Marcia felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Where?" "It's at a bar near the precinct," Casey replied. "A lot of the officers who were on the fence are going. He's trying to rally them." Marcia clenched her jaw. This was it, Daniels' last attempt to push back against her leadership. She knew she couldn't let him succeed. "I'm going," Marcia said, her voice firm. Casey hesitated. "Are you sure? It could get ugly." "I'm sure," Marcia replied. "I need to put an end to this." As she hung up the phone and grabbed her coat, Marcia knew that this was the moment of truth. Daniels was trying to undermine everything she had worked for. And if she didn't confront him now, he might succeed. But she wasn't going to let that happen. When Marcia arrived at the bar, the atmosphere was tense. A group of officers, including Daniels and several of his loyalists, were gathered at a large table in the back. As soon as she entered, the room went quiet, all eyes turning toward her. Marcia didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the table, her expression calm but determined. Daniels looked up as she approached, his face hardening. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it isn't the chief herself. Come to join us?" Marcia ignored the taunt and stood at the head of the table, looking around at the officers. Some met her gaze, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "I'm here because I know what's going on," Marcia said, her voice steady but firm. "Daniels is trying to turn you against me. He's trying to stop the changes that this department needs. But let me be clear. This walkout, this rebellion, it's not going to work. I'm not leaving, and this department is moving forward. You can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. But if you think for 1 second that Daniels is going to lead you anywhere but down, you're mistaken." Marcia took a deep breath and walked out of the break room. The tension in the air was palpable as she made her way back to her office. She could feel the weight of everything she had experienced since becoming the new commander. More than the title, more than the responsibility. This role came with an immense amount of scrutiny and resistance. The incident with the officers stopping her had not been resolved in full. Yes, they realized who she was, and there was some level of discomfort when they found out she was their new boss. But it didn't change the fact that their attitudes still represented a deeply ingrained problem that stretched far beyond two people. Marcia leaned against her desk, the gravity of her position sinking in. The initial victory in establishing her authority over those officers was only the tip of the iceberg. Now she faced the much larger task of changing an entire culture that was hostile toward her, and not just toward her, but to the very idea of change. As she thought about her next move, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she called out. Lieutenant Jackson stepped inside, her second in command and one of the few people Marcia knew she could trust. "Chief, I thought I'd check in on you," Jackson said, closing the door softly behind her. "I know the last couple of days have been a lot." "More than a lot," Marcia said with a heavy sigh, glancing out the window. "It's exhausting." "I can imagine," Jackson said, her voice filled with empathy. "I've been hearing murmurs. There are a few officers who aren't happy about the way things are going. They feel threatened." Marcia laughed without humor. Threatened? By what? Doing their jobs fairly? You know how it is, Jackson said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the wall. Change, especially the kind you're trying to implement, makes people uncomfortable. They're used to a certain way of operating, and now that you're here, representing something completely different, well, they don't like it. I know, Marcia said quietly, shaking her head. It's hard to believe that this is the fight we still have to have. We shouldn't even be in this position. I should be able to walk into this precinct as their commander, do my job, and go home like anyone else. But you know it's never been that simple, Jackson said softly. We've both had to fight tooth and nail just to get to this point. And now that you're here at the top, you're going to face even more pushback. I just don't know if I have the energy for it anymore, Marcia admitted, her voice betraying a rare moment of vulnerability. Jackson straightened up and stepped forward, her eyes locking with Marcia's. You do, Chief. You've come too far to let them win now. You knew what this would take when you accepted the position, and you knew the kind of people you'd be up against. You've got the community behind you, and you've got me. You're not doing this alone. Marcia smiled faintly, appreciating Jackson's unwavering support. Thank you. It helps to hear that, especially now, but I can't help but think about the officers like Stevens and Harris. How many more like them are lurking in the background, waiting for their moment to resist me? Jackson's face grew serious. There's more than just a handful. And some of them are higher up. They're not going to make this easy. I've got to root them out, Marcia said, her resolve hardening. I can't change things unless I know who's working against me. That's a dangerous game, Jackson warned. Some of them have been here a long time, and they've got alliances that go way up the chain. Marcia's eyes darkened with determination. I don't care how long they've been here or who they're connected to. If they're part of the problem, they're going to be dealt with. I'm not here to make friends or protect anyone's ego. This department is going to change one way or another. Jackson nodded, sensing that Marcia had made up her mind. Then I'll help you. We'll start looking into the ones who've been the most resistant and figure out where the loyalties lie. But be careful, Marcia. You've already seen what happens when you challenge them, and they'll fight back. I'm ready, Marcia said firmly. Let them come. I'm not backing down. Jackson gave her a nod of respect before heading toward the door. All right, I'll get things started on my end. We'll get through this. After Jackson left, Marcia sat down at her desk, her fingers tapping restlessly on the wood surface. She knew that change wouldn't come easily and that the fight was only beginning, but she had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Mayor Hastings. Chief Wilson, the mayor greeted her with a tone that was both friendly and professional. I wanted to touch base after everything that's been happening over the past few days. I appreciate the call, Mayor, Marcia replied, sitting up straighter in her chair. Things have been challenging, to say the least, but we're handling it. I have no doubt that you are, the mayor said, but I want to be clear. There's pressure coming from multiple angles right now. The community is watching every move you make, and the city council is expecting results. You've got their support, but they're also expecting progress. I understand, Marcia said, her voice measured. I'm working on it, but you and I both know that turning a department like this around isn't going to happen overnight. True, but optics matter, Hastings said, his voice tightening slightly. There are certain individuals who are concerned about the backlash from the old guard. They're worried about unrest within the department. Marcia gritted her teeth. She knew exactly who those individuals were. People who had been part of the problem for years and were now scrambling to cover their tracks. I've got it under control, Marcia said, her tone firm. But I'm not here to placate anyone. My job is to fix this department, not to preserve the status quo. There was a brief pause on the other end before Hastings replied, Just be careful, Marcia. There are people who don't want things to change, and they'll do whatever it takes to stop you. Keep your allies close and keep an eye on the ones who aren't. Believe me, Marcia said quietly. I'm watching everyone. Jackson nodded, already formulating a plan in her mind. I'll start with the internal reports. There's been chatter that Stevens has been bending the rules when it comes to certain cases. If we can prove that, we'll have enough to put him in check. Good, Marcia said, her resolve hardening. But we need to move carefully. I don't want this to turn into an all-out war. We need to maintain control over the narrative. Jackson stood up, the weight of the task ahead settling on both of them. I'll get started right away. As Jackson left the room, Marcia sat back and closed her eyes for a moment. She had always known this job would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the level of resistance she would face from within. The challenge wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing hearts and minds, something far more difficult and dangerous. A few hours later, Marcia was finishing up some paperwork when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jackson. Found something on Stevens. Meet me in the conference room. Marcia quickly grabbed her things and made her way down the hallway, her mind racing with possibilities. If Jackson had found something concrete, it could be the break they needed. When she entered the conference room, Jackson was already seated, a file open in front of her. She looked up as Marcia walked in, her expression serious. I found a few discrepancies in some of Stevens' reports, Jackson said, sliding the file across the table. It looks like he's been manipulating arrest records. He's been over-reporting minor offenses in certain neighborhoods and under-reporting incidents involving his own team. It's subtle, but when you compare his reports to the official logs, the discrepancies are glaring. Marcia scanned the documents, her heart pounding. This was exactly what she needed, proof that Stevens wasn't just resisting her leadership, but that he was actively corrupting the department from within. This is it, Marcia said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. This is how we take him down. Jackson nodded. I've got more where that came from. Stevens has been bending the rules for a while now, and I think we can use this to force him out. Marcia looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze. We need to be careful with how we proceed. If we go public with this too soon, it could backfire. Stevens has allies, and they'll come to his defense if they think I'm targeting him unfairly. Jackson leaned back in her chair, considering the options. So what's the next move? Marcia thought for a moment before responding. We need to build a case that's airtight. We'll gather more evidence. Enough to show that Stevens has been corrupting the system. Then when the time is right, we'll confront him. And if he tries to fight back, Jackson asked, Marcia's eyes hardened. Then we'll be ready for him. As Marcia left the conference room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had the evidence she needed to take down one of the biggest obstacles standing in her way, and now it was just a matter of timing. The battle was far from over, but Marcia was ready to face whatever came next. Back in her office, Marcia sat down and began reviewing the files Jackson had given her. Every piece of evidence brought her closer to the moment she would confront Stevens and expose him for what he was. The tension in the precinct was mounting, and Marcia knew that the next few weeks would be crucial. Stevens had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. Now it was her turn to show him exactly who he was dealing with. As the tension in the precinct continued to rise, Marcia knew she had to tread carefully. The information Jackson had uncovered was significant, but it wasn't enough to go straight to the top. She needed to gather more evidence to not only confront Stevens, but to ensure that when the moment came, he wouldn't be able to wiggle his way out of it. She would need the full weight of her office behind her if she was going to make this stick. A few days passed, and the atmosphere in the precinct grew tenser with each passing hour. Officers seemed to whisper among themselves, and Marcia could feel eyes on her whenever she walked through the hallways. It was clear that word was spreading. Stevens and his supporters were rallying their defenses, and the battle lines were quietly being drawn. Jackson, ever resourceful, continued her investigation into Stevens. The more she dug, the more she found. Stevens had been involved in several incidents that, when pieced together, painted a troubling picture of someone who had been manipulating the system for years. It wasn't just the arrest reports. Stevens had been actively creating a culture of intimidation within the department. He had his loyalists, officers who benefited from his brand of leadership, and they were complicit in maintaining his power. One afternoon, Jackson came to Marcia's office, her expression grave. I've got something else, she said, handing over another file. This one's big. Marcia opened the file and began reading. It detailed an internal complaint made by a junior officer several months ago. The office, who had requested anonymity, had accused Stevens of coercing him into falsifying reports and intimidating witnesses in a key case. The complaint had been quietly buried, likely by someone within Stevens' circle of influence. This is it, Marcia said, her voice low but steady. This is what we've been waiting for. Jackson nodded. It's enough to get him suspended at the very least. If we play this right, we can dismantle his whole operation. Marcia knew they were approaching a critical juncture. Stevens wasn't just going to go quietly, and his loyalists would fight to protect him. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to wait any longer. If she let this fester, it would only embolden Stevens and his supporters, and soon she'd have a full-scale revolt on her hands. The next day, Marcia called a meeting with her most trusted officers, including Jackson, to lay out her plan. The group gathered in a small, dimly lit conference room, the tension palpable. Everyone knew what was at stake. We've gathered enough evidence to take action against Stevens, Marcia began, her voice calm but firm. But we need to be strategic. If we move too quickly or without enough force, we risk pushing his supporters into open defiance. We need to isolate him and we need to do it carefully. Jackson spoke up. We've got a solid case, but we need to make sure it's airtight. Once we go public with this, there's no turning back. Stevens will fight, and his allies will try to muddy the waters. Marcia nodded. Exactly. That's why I want to make this as clean as possible. We're going to confront Stevens directly, present him with the evidence, and give him a chance to step down quietly. If he refuses, we'll go public and suspend him immediately. But we need to be ready for the fallout. The officers around the table exchanged glances, their expressions serious. They understood the gravity of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about removing one corrupt officer. It was about shifting the entire culture of the department. We'll be ready, one of the senior officers said. Stevens has had too much power for too long. It's time someone took him down. Marcia felt a surge of resolve. She had come too far to back down now. Stevens had been a thorn in her side since the day she took the job. And now she finally had the means to stop him. The plan was set in motion the following morning. Marcia called Stevens into her office under the guise of a routine meeting. When he arrived, she could see the tension in his posture. He knew something was up, but he didn't yet know the full extent of it. Stevens, Marcia began, her tone even but authoritative. We need to have a serious conversation. Stevens leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. What's this about, Chief? Marcia slid the file across the desk toward him. I think you know exactly what this is about. Stevens opened the file and began to read, his face slowly hardening as he realized what was happening. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. These are baseless accusations. They're not, Marcia replied calmly. We've got plenty of evidence to back up every claim in that file. Falsified reports, coercion, witness intimidation. It's all there and it all points to you. Stevens slammed the file shut, his face turning red. This is a witch hunt. You're just trying to get rid of me because I won't bend to your so-called reforms. Marcia met his gaze, her expression unyielding. This isn't about my reforms. It's about corruption, and you've been at the center of it for far too long. Stevens stood up, his fist clenched. You think you can take me down? I've got people in this department who will back me no matter what. You're the one who's outnumbered here, Chief. Marcia stood up as well, her voice steady but firm. Maybe, but the difference between you and me, Stevens, is that I'm not afraid to stand alone if I have to. I'm not afraid to do what's right, even if it costs me everything. Can you say the same? Stevens glared at her, his eyes filled with fury. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out, but then he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Marcia sat back down, her heart pounding. The confrontation had been intense, but it wasn't over yet. Stevens was going to fight back, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Jackson entered the office a few moments later. How'd it go? Marcia exhaled slowly. He's not going down without a fight. Jackson nodded. We expected that, but we've got the upper hand now. He knows it. Marcia looked out the window, her thoughts racing. The real battle was just beginning, and she knew that the days ahead would be some of the toughest of her career. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. Stevens and everything he stood for had to be rooted out, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, tensions within the department escalated. The whispers among officers grew louder, and the division between those loyal to Stevens and those aligned with Marcia became more pronounced. Stevens hadn't gone quietly, as expected. He had started to rally his supporters, subtly spreading a narrative that Marcia's leadership was a threat to the department's way of doing things. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone could feel that a showdown was imminent. Marcia remained resolute. She knew that confronting Stevens had been necessary, but she also understood that this wasn't just about him. It was about shifting the culture of the entire department. Stevens's influence ran deep, and she had to be careful about how she handled things moving forward. Jackson continued to work behind the scenes, gathering more evidence, and quietly speaking with officers who were on the fence about where their loyalties lay. She had made it clear to them that aligning with Stevens would mean backing a system of corruption, and that standing with Marcia was about standing for integrity and the future of the department. Slowly but surely, more officers started to come around. Some were hesitant, still fearing the potential backlash, but others were beginning to realize that change was inevitable. One afternoon, as Marcia sat in her office reviewing the latest reports, she received a knock at the door. It was Jackson. I've got news, Jackson said as she stepped inside. We've managed to pull in a few more officers. They're starting to see the bigger picture. Marcia nodded, though she knew the fight was far from over. That's good, but we're not out of the woods yet. Stevens still has his supporters, and they're not going to back down without a fight. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, her expression serious. There's something else. I've been hearing rumors that Stevens is planning something big. He's not going to sit back and let us take him down without making some sort of power play. Marcia frowned. What kind of power play? I don't have all the details yet, but from what I've gathered, he's trying to organize a formal complaint against you. He's hoping to get enough officers on his side to create a real crisis of confidence in your leadership. If he can stir up enough trouble, he might be able to push for your removal. Marcia's jaw tightened. So that's his plan. He's trying to turn this into a political game. Jackson nodded. Exactly. He's trying to frame this as a leadership issue, not a corruption issue. If he can make it look like you're the one causing division, he might just pull it off. Marcia stood up and began pacing the room. She had anticipated Stevens would fight back, but this was a more calculated move than she had expected. He was trying to manipulate the narrative, make it seem like the department was falling apart under her leadership. And if enough officers backed him, it could create a real problem for her. We need to get ahead of this, Marcia said, her mind racing. If Stevens is going to play dirty, we need to make sure we're one step ahead of him. Jackson nodded in agreement. What's the plan? Marcia stopped pacing and turned to face her. We need to bring this out into the open. Stevens is trying to play this behind the scenes. But if we confront him publicly with the evidence we've gathered, we'll force his hand. He can't deny it if it's all out in the open. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You want to take this public? It's the only way, Marcia replied. We've been building our case quietly, but now we need to make it clear that this isn't about leadership. It's about corruption. Once we make the evidence public, Stevens won't be able to hide behind his lies. We'll also need to make sure the community is on our side. If they see that we're committed to cleaning up the department, they'll back us. Jackson smiled. You really think it'll work? Marcia nodded. It has to. We've come too far to let Stevens turn this into a political battle. This is about the future of the department, and we're not going to let him win. The following day, Marcia called a press conference. It was an unprecedented move. Rarely did the police chief make such a public address, especially when it involved internal affairs. But Marcia knew this was the only way to expose Stevens and his corruption for what it was. She had prepared meticulously, gathering all the evidence she and Jackson had uncovered over the past few weeks. She knew this would be the defining moment of her career, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. When the press conference began, the room was packed with reporters, community members, and even some of the department's officers. Marcia could see the tension in the air. Everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. Stevens wasn't there. He had likely heard about the conference and was preparing his own countermove. Marcia stepped up to the podium, her expression calm and collected. She began by addressing the recent issues within the department, acknowledging the internal struggles and the tensions that had arisen. But then she shifted gears. What we're dealing with here isn't just a leadership issue, Marcia said, her voice steady. It's about corruption. It's about officers who have used their power for personal gain, who have manipulated the system and violated the trust of the people they were sworn to protect. The room went silent. Marcia continued, presenting the evidence she and Jackson had gathered. She spoke about the falsified reports, the witness intimidation, and the internal complaints that had been buried. She didn't name Stevens directly, but it was clear to everyone in the room who she was talking about. By the time she finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The reporters were scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and the officers in attendance were exchanging uneasy glances. Marcia knew she had struck a nerve. We will not tolerate corruption in this department, Marcia said, her voice growing stronger. We will root it out, and we will hold those responsible accountable. This is not just about cleaning up the department. It's about restoring trust. Trust with the community and trust within our own ranks. And let me be clear, anyone who stands in the way of that will be dealt with accordingly. With that, Marcia stepped away from the podium, her heart pounding. The press conference had gone exactly as she had hoped, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Stevens would retaliate, but now the public knew the truth. The tide was starting to turn, and Marcia was ready for whatever came next. As the fallout from the press conference spread, the department buzzed with whispers of what would happen next. Officers who had once supported Stevens began to waver, unsure of their position now that Marcia had publicly laid out the corruption within their ranks. The tide was turning, but it wasn't without resistance. Stevens wasn't about to go down without a fight. The morning after the press conference, Marcia arrived at the precinct to find a thick tension in the air. Some officers avoided eye contact as she walked by, while others offered her curt nods of respect. It was clear that the department was divided, and Marcia knew that the coming days would be critical. Jackson met her in her office, her expression serious. It's all over the news. You did it. People are talking, and the community is rallying behind you. Marcia nodded, but she didn't allow herself to feel any relief just yet. And Stevens? Jackson's face darkened. He's not taking it well. I've heard he's trying to rally his supporters. But after the press conference, a lot of them are backing off. They don't want to be caught on the wrong side of this. Marcia sighed, knowing this would be the case. He'll fight back harder. He's too deep in this to walk away quietly. We're ready, Jackson said firmly. We've got more evidence, and the oversight board is fully on board with us. If Stevens tries to pull anything, we'll shut him down. Marcia sat down at her desk, her mind racing. Stevens was dangerous, not just because of his position, but because he was desperate. People like him, when cornered, tended to make reckless decisions, and that worried her more than anything. We need to keep pushing, Marcia said. If we give him any breathing room, he'll use it to turn this around. We need to make it clear that his time is up. Jackson nodded in agreement, but before she could say anything else, the door to Marcia's office swung open. It was Lieutenant Harris, one of the older officers who had been on the fence since the beginning. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Chief, we need to talk," Harris said, his voice low. Marcia raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to sit. Jackson remained standing by the door, watching carefully. Harris sat down, his hands clasped together. "I've been with this department for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of changes, and I've worked under a lot of different leaders. Some good, some bad." He paused, his gaze fixed on Marcia. "But what you're doing, it's different." Marcia waited, unsure where this was going. "I wasn't sure about you at first," Harris admitted. "You came in here, shaking things up, and it felt like you were attacking the very foundation of what we've built." Marcia nodded, understanding his perspective. "I'm not here to tear down the department, Lieutenant. I'm here to rebuild it into something better." Harris let out a slow breath. "I've seen a lot of officers who think they're above the law. Stevens, he's one of them. I won't lie, I've turned a blind eye to things I shouldn't have. But after everything that's happened, after that press conference," he trailed off, as if weighing his words. "I don't want to be on the wrong side of history." Marcia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "I'm glad to hear that, Lieutenant. We need more people like you who are willing to step up and make a difference." Harris nodded. "I've spoken to some of the others. They're ready to back you. Stevens has lost a lot of support, but he's still got a few loyalists. You need to be careful. He's not going to go down quietly." "I know," Marcia said, "and that's why we need to move fast." Harris stood, giving her a small nod of respect before he left the office. Once he was gone, Jackson turned to Marcia, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "He's one of the good ones," Jackson said. Marcia nodded. "And we're going to need him." Over the next few days, the pressure on Stevens continued to mount. Officers who had once supported him began to distance themselves, and the oversight board started taking a more active role in the department's affairs. Marcia worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, holding internal meetings, and continuing to build the case against Stevens. It was a grueling process, but she knew it was necessary. One evening, just as she was about to leave the precinct, her phone rang. It was Jackson. "Chief, you need to get down here," Jackson said, her voice urgent. "It's Stevens. He's at the precinct and he's causing a scene." Marcia's heart raced. "I'm on my way." When she arrived at the precinct, she found Stevens standing in the middle of the squad room, surrounded by a small group of officers. His face was flushed with anger, and he was shouting at anyone who would listen. "This is a witch hunt," Stevens yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "She's trying to take me down, but I won't let her. I've given everything to this department, and I'm not going to let some outsider come in here and destroy it." Marcia stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. "Stevens," Marcia said, her voice calm but firm, "you need to stop this." Stevens turned to face her, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can just come in here and ruin everything? You're the one who doesn't belong here. You've been trying to turn everyone against me, but it won't work." "This isn't about me," Marcia said. "This is about the department. This is about doing what's right." Stevens sneered. "Right? You don't even know what that means. You're just trying to make a name for yourself." Marcia took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm trying to fix what's broken. And if you can't see that, then you're part of the problem." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Stevens clenched his fists, his face red with anger. "You won't get away with this. I'm going to fight you every step of the way." Marcia stood her ground, her voice steady. "Then you'll lose, Stevens, because this department is changing, whether you like it or not." Stevens glared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with anger. But then slowly the fight seemed to drain out of him. He knew he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. Without another word, Stevens turned and stormed out of the precinct. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Marcia watched him go, knowing that this wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a victory. The department was changing, and Stevens' influence was fading. There would still be challenges ahead, but Marcia was ready for them. As she turned to leave the squad room, Jackson stepped up beside her. "You did it," Jackson said quietly. Marcia smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We did it, but there's still a lot of work to do." And as they walked out of the precinct together, Marcia knew that the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The department was changing, and nothing would stop it.